Welcome to According to Sam, folks. This is episode 368. Thank you guys for joining me. Got a good podcast for you today. It's coming out a little bit late today, but I want to get right into it because I have a lot to share today. We'll see how much we get into. We'll see if we get back into the history of the Babylonian captivity that we've been covering, but I have some other stuff that I want to start off with today. It's another December, another holiday with another brutal terrorist attack that happened over the weekend on the first day of Hanukkah in Australia. There was a terrorist attack. Muslim extremists, Islamists, opening fire in Australia on a Jewish celebration of Hanukkah. And this is something that's happening. If you go and you look up over the past 25 years, the terrorist attacks in the month of December around the holidays. Last year, you had the attack in Melbourne, at the Christmas market, the Muslim driving over and killing a bunch of people. If you go and you look at it, the shoe bomber, the underwear bomber, they just thwarted another attack here in the United States that was supposed to take place over New Year's Eve. We had the attack last year in New Orleans over New Year's Eve. It's something that's happening every year during the holidays. It seems like December and early January, the holiday season is like terrorist season. So we had a terrorist attack over the weekend in Australia, killing Jews. Everyone's worried about the rise of anti-Semitism. And I want to talk about the history of the persecution of Jews in the beginning of this podcast. We'll try to get through as much of this as we can, and then get back into a little bit of the Babylonian captivity and pick that up. But I want to start with playing Benjamin Netanyahu, Prime Minister of Israel, his remarks after this terrorist attack that took place in Australia yesterday. And I want you to listen to what he says here.
On August 17th, about 4 months ago, I sent Prime Minister Albanese of Australia a letter in which I gave him warning that the Australian government's policy was promoting and encouraging anti-Semitism in Australia. I wrote, "Your call for a Palestinian state pours fuel on the anti-Semitic fire. It rewards Hamas terrorism. It emboldens those who menace Australian Jews and encourages the Jew hatred now stalking your streets. Anti-Semitism is a cancer. It spreads when leaders stay silent. It retreats when leaders act. I call upon you to replace weakness with action, appeasement with resolve. Instead, Prime Minister, you replaced weakness with weakness and appeasement with more appeasement."
I want you to imagine after 9/11, if the leader of another country would have come out and said and many countries warned the Bush administration before 9/11 that, hey, you guys have terrorists in your country and they're getting ready to execute this attack. Several countries warned the Bush administration. Could you imagine a leader of one of those countries coming out after 9/11 and say, "We warned you. We told you that you were appeasing these Muslim extremists and you let this happen." And no sympathy, no condolences at all. Benjamin Netanyahu is speaking to the leader. I mean, within hours of a tragedy like this in Australia, speaking to the leader of Australia like he's Benjamin Netanyahu's son and that he's disappointed in him. Could you imagine someone coming out after 9/11 and saying to George Bush that you have the blood of Americans on your hands, George Bush? Now, if someone would have said that, they would have absolutely it would have absolutely been true. And what Benjamin Netanyahu is saying here to the president of Australia may very well be true. But could you imagine someone saying that to George Bush, even though it would have been true for them to say that? That you have the blood of Americans on your hands, that you let this happen. You knew that they were in their country. You were warned on August 6th in your daily brief that bin Laden's determined to attack in the United States and they're getting ready to hijack planes. Could you imagine a leader of another country saying that the way Benjamin Netanyahu is saying within hours of a tragic attack in Australia, like what happened? No condolences, no sympathy. I am really, really shocked by this, and that he can say this, that this happened because you supported a Palestinian state. Many countries supported a Palestinian state. Many countries supported said that they came out and said that they support a Palestinian state. Is now the time to throw that in their faces because you have a tragedy like this that happens? I cannot believe what I'm witnessing. So everyone's talking about the rise of anti-Semitism and the fact that that anti-Semitism is on the rise, and this is the latest example of anti-Semitism, despite the fact that, like I said, last year we had a Muslim attack here in the United States in New Orleans. You had a Muslim attack in Melbourne last year, or in Germany last year, where guy drives through a Christmas market, killing tons of Germans, and it seems to be happening every year. But it happens this year, and it happens to Jews, and this is evidence of the rise of anti-Semitism. But Jews have been the target of persecution for years. And that's what I want to get into in this podcast and talk about the persecution of Jews, the expulsion of Jews throughout, the centuries, beginning with the Assyrian captivity, which we've been talking about, that started in 700 BC, and then the Babylonian captivity, and then the persecution by the Romans, or the persecution by the Greeks, which is the whole reason that you have the celebration of Hanukkah and the Maccabean rebellion, the persecution by the Romans, the destruction of the Second Temple, the spreading of the diaspora that took place beginning with the Assyrian captivity, and then the Babylonian captivity, and then they come back and they build the Second Temple, and then the Second Temple is destroyed by the Jews, and the diaspora is spread again, and then the Jews go all over the world, and they're persecuted all over the world, like the Bible says. The Bible says that this is going to happen. We've read in the book of Deuteronomy, because the fact of the matter is that Jews were never meant to live outside of the land that God had preserved for them. And God not only promised and gave them that land, but that's where it was supposed to be a Jewish homeland, and it was supposed to be a land where the God of this universe protected the Jews. But because they broke the covenant, because they started down the road of idolatry and idol worship and worshiping pagan gods and all that stuff, the Bible says that God scattered them throughout the world, and that they were going to be persecuted when they went throughout the world. When God scattered them, they were going to be persecuted when they went to other places throughout the world. And that's exactly what has happened to the Jews throughout their history all over the world. They've been persecuted. The expulsion of the Jews, this is a Wikipedia page that I want to focus on, but you can see the very first event that in this Wikipedia page, the expulsion of the Jews, is the Assyrian captivity. And then from the Assyrian captivity, you have the expulsion from Samaria. This is by the Assyrians as well. And then you have the Babylonian captivity here. Then you have the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, and the persecution by the Romans, the persecution by the Greeks, like I said. You get into the 6th to the 10th century, and the persecution by the Visigoths, and the persecution by the Byzantines, and then the Muslims come into the picture in around the 7th century. And then you have all the persecutions by the Muslims in the 11th to 13th century. You have the Crusades. You have the persecutions in Europe, in France, and Jews being persecuted and expelled all over the world. All over the world. You can see here, Wales, 1290, England, 1290, France, and 1182, 1306, 1321 in France, Provence, the Papal States, Germany, Austria, Lithuania, Hungary, Crimea, Tunisia, Spain, Portugal, persecuted everywhere they went. They were persecuted for centuries. This has been the history of the Jewish people. I have a first clip that I want to start with today, and it talks about some of these places that Jews were expelled from. We're going to focus in on the Jews being expelled from Spain, because I want to note something with the Jews being expelled from Spain. But let's listen to this clip.
What if I told you there's a group of people who were expelled not once, not twice, but over 100 times, across continents, across centuries, from Spain to Russia, from England to Yemen, from cities that no longer exist to nations that still deny it? Why were the Jews forced to flee again and again, century after century? Why did kings, caliphs, and even democratic governments push them out, burn their books, seize their homes, and blame them? Is it religion? Is it money? Is it myth? Tonight, we're digging into the pages history tried to burn, because before the Holocaust, before pogroms, there was something worse. A pattern, and it's time we see it. Let's be clear from the start. The Jewish story isn't just a tale of survival. It's a story of displacement, of being pushed, pulled, blamed, used, and exiled again and again. Most people think of exile as a single moment Jerusalem falls. The people scatter and history moves on. But that's not how it happened. It happened over and over again.
Over and over.
Across continents, across empires, across belief systems. It didn't matter who ruled: Christian kings, Muslim sultans, atheist, commissar. Again and again, one small group became the convenient enemy. Let's trace the map of memory through time and space. Ask why. 70 AD, the fall of Jerusalem. Rome, the mightiest empire the world had ever known, marched into Jerusalem to crush a rebellion. They destroyed the Second Temple, the heart of Jewish identity, culture, and worship. Tens of thousands were killed. The survivors were dragged across the empire, sold as slaves, scattered to the winds. This was the beginning of the diaspora.
So that's kind of a pet peeve of mine, a pet peeve that people say that the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD was the beginning of the scattering of the diaspora. That's not true. That's not true. The beginning of the scattering of the diaspora was the Assyrian captivity, which happened 800 years before the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD. The scattering of the northern 10 tribes was the beginning of the scattering of the diaspora. And many people say this over and over again, and you'll hear them say this, that the scattering of the diaspora happened after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. That's not true. The scattering of the diaspora, the Jewish diaspora, started 800 years before the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD, and it happened during the Assyrian captivity. So that's not true.
Thousands were killed. The survivors were dragged across the empire, sold as slaves, scattered to the winds. This was the beginning of the diaspora, the scattering of the Jewish people, but it was only the beginning. 1290, England's silent expulsion. Under King Edward I, Jews were formally expelled from England. Why? Officially, for usury, for being different, for being other. But here's the real story. The Crown owed Jewish moneylenders massive debts. Rather than repay them, Edward simply expelled them. He seized their assets, erased their rights, and declared it righteous. Thousands were with only what they could carry. The rest were imprisoned, or worse. For over 350 years, no Jews legally lived in England. A nation built on law, chivalry, and the Magna Carta had no place for Jews. 1492, Spain, the year of glory and grief. 1492 is remembered for Columbus discovering the New World. But that same year, Spain committed a cultural genocide. The Alhambra Decree gave every Jew in Spain a choice: convert, leave, or die.
All right, so I want to focus on the on what happened in Spain in the 15th century, late 15th century, 1492. This is under Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabel of Castile. Ferdinand and Isabel, they expelled the Jews, like the video just said, forced them to either convert to Christianity or to leave Spain or die or kill them. They were, and everyone focuses on the expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492. But something happened in Spain and throughout all of Europe, quite frankly, but it was focused in Spain prior to 1492. The persecution of Jews started about 150 years prior, and this was in the 14th century during the bubonic plague. Now, most of the Jews who lived in Spain, no, not most of them, all the Jews who lived in Spain were Sephardic Jews. And the word Sephardic, it basically translates from Hebrew into Iberia. So these were Jews that live, it basically is Spain. So Sephardic means Spain. Sephardic Jews are Jews from Spain. And if you notice, the Jews from Spain, they all had dark hair, dark eyes, dark skin. They had more of the phenotype and features of Middle Easterns. They were very different from the Ashkenazi Jews who migrated to Northern Europe. Many of the Ashkenazi Jews had blonde hair, had lighter skin. They're more in line with white people. I mean, it was very easy for Ashkenazi Jews to blend in as white people during the Holocaust and things of that nature. But the Sephardic Jews were more, again, had the Middle Eastern phenotype, dark hair, dark features. And the Sephardic Jews are the ones who lived in the Iberian Peninsula in Spain, and they were the ones who were expelled in the late 15th century by Ferdinand and Isabella. But something happened prior to that, and that was the persecution of the Jews during the Black Death, during the bubonic plague, which happened in the 14th century, and the Jews were persecuted during the bubonic plague. I have a couple of clips that I want to play about what took place in Spain, in Europe during the plague, and how Jews were persecuted. This was over 150 years before the expulsion that took place under Ferdinand and Isabella. Take a listen.
In a world seeking to appease God's fury, Christian tolerance crumbled as the community began a murderous purge. Neighbor turned on neighbor, seeking out scapegoats, heretics, outsiders and the Jews.
If you're convinced that God is angry at you, you look around and say, what has made God mad? Well, there can be few sins worse than denying what you understand to be the true God as the true God.
So I want to explain that the Jews didn't do anything to encourage this persecution. Like the video that we were just looking at, the expulsion that took place in England under Edward, at least the reason that was given that King Edward gave was that the Jews were participating in usury. And I've explained to you many times that, yes, the Jews were participating in usury all over Europe, but there were a lot of Christians that were using the Jews as fronts so they can invest money and also participate in usury. But they were Catholic, so they couldn't do it legally. So they would use the Jews as fronts, namely the Knights Templar. But there were many other Christians who used the Jews as fronts to lend money, and they would invest money, and they were able to get a return. But that was the excuse that was used to expel Jews from England in the 12th century, 13th century. But what was going on in Spain during the plague, the Sephardic Jews in Spain, they weren't doing anything. They weren't doing anything to encourage this persecution. The only reason that these Christians in the region of Spain started persecuting Jews is because everyone was dying because of this plague, and people didn't understand anything about germs and where the plague had come from. This was a punishment from God, is what the Catholics and Christians in Spain believe, that the reason that everyone's dying is not because of this germ, this plague that we don't understand, is because this is punishment from God. And the reason that God is punishing us and people are dying is because we have allowed these Jews to live in our midst who reject Jesus Christ. This is what was going on in the region of Spain, in many parts of Europe during the bubonic plague.
What has made God mad? Well, there can be few sins worse than denying what you understand to be the true God as the true God. And in their mind, that's what Jews were doing.
The Jews were accused of plots to destroy all Christendom. In the spring of 1348, Jews from Narbonne and Carcassonne were dragged from their homes and burned at the stake.
Some wretched men were found in possession of certain powders, and whether justly or unjustly, God knows, were accused of poisoning the wells, with the result that anxious men now refuse to drink the waters. Some of these men were burnt for this act and are being burnt daily, it being ordered that they should be punished thus.
The brutal atrocities were recorded by the court bailiffs.
Here follows the confession of one of the Jews made on the 8th of October 1348 in the castle of Chillon. Elisa, the wife of Aquitus the Jew, was put to question. Now, when it was over, she confessed that around midsummer last, the Jew Provençal gave her some poison. She was to put this in the wells to poison the people using them.
So it's a complete lie. They were torturing them. They were persecuting them. They were blaming them for this plague. And the Jews were, this is 150 years before the expulsion that was carried out on the orders of Ferdinand and Isabella. Now, before the expulsion, the official expulsion of the Jews, during the persecutions of the Black Death, a large number of Jews, they started to flee the region of Spain and the Iberian Peninsula, the Sephardic Jews. And where did these Sephardic Jews go? They started to go into the regions of where the Ashkenazi Jews were, namely Poland. So you can see here, it says the persecutions led to a large migration of Jews to the Jagiellonian Poland, and this was during the dynasty the Jagiellonian dynasty in Poland. There's a story that there was a king there in Poland that had a Jewish mistress, and she convinced him to invite the Jews to come and take safe haven there in the area of Poland. So that's why many of these Jews were in Poland, and this huge population of Jews in Poland when Adolf Hitler and the Nazis, invade Poland in the middle of the 20th century, because they were invited there. Mostly of these people who were Sephardic Jews who had come from Spain to live in Poland, to have refuge in Poland. So that's where they ended up. I want to play a little bit of this clip that talks about the difference between Sephardic Jews and the we'll look at this one first. This is the difference between Sephardic Jews and Ashkenazi Jews. Ashkenazi Jews being, again, the Jews from Northern Europe that, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, white-skinned Jews, very different from Sephardic Jews. This clip goes into a little bit about the differences.
Before getting into the list, a quick review of who these two groups are. Ashkenazi Jews originally came from Germany, France, and Eastern Europe, while Sephardic Jews originally came from Portugal and Spain, and later lived in all of these places. Notably, there's a lot of overlap in who lived where, and not all Jews neatly fit into these two categories, not by a long shot. Mizrahi Jews, for instance, are largely from the Middle East, and they share many customs with the Sephardic Jews. So much so that in Israel, many think of them as one group. And then there are Ethiopian Jews, Italkim, and many others. But in America, these are the two biggest groups of Jews. And living in these separate areas created many differences, beyond just the shade of the color of their skin. Number 1, the food. Bagels, matzo ball soup, gefilte fish, kugel, all Ashkenazi. They come from countries where Ashkenazi Jews used to live, and they're still served in those countries under different names. Think cold weather Eastern European fare. Arafina, shakshuka, mufleta, all Sephardic. Coming from warmer countries, they're often more colorful and might actually be spicy. In other words, both groups have taken on and adapted dishes from the countries where they lived.
All right, so there are many differences between Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews. So what is happening after the persecution during the bubonic plague, when the Jagiellonian dynasty, the monarchs invite the Sephardic Jews to come to Northern Europe, to Lithuania, to Poland for refuge, then they start mixing in the Sephardic Jews with the Ashkenazi Jews. I want to play this clip too that goes into a little bit of the difference between Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews. Take a listen.
Sephardic is more than a geographic connection. No single word can ever fully capture all of the messy nuances of human identity, especially when people use the same words to mean vastly different things. Like Sephardic and Mizrahi. If you ask your average Jew to explain the difference,
Let me explain.
here's the oversimplified response they'd likely give.
Let me sum up.
Sephardic means from Sfarad, or Spain, and refers to Jews with roots in the Iberian Peninsula. Meanwhile, Mizrahi, or Eastern, is a catch-all meant to describe Jews from the Arab and Muslim worlds. But that's an oversimplification. Here's why. In terms of the meaning of the words, yeah, both Sephardic and Mizrahi refer to geography. Sephardic maps to Iberia. Mizrahi maps to some ambiguous place in the so-called East.
Can you be more specific?
But that's not all those words represent. Sephardic also refers to a school of thought, a specific worldview about how to observe Judaism.
Not just a place, but a state of mind.
For hundreds of years, Jews thrived in Iberia. New schools of Jewish philosophy came into being. Sephardic scholars like the Rambam revolutionized the study of Jewish law. At the same time, Ashkenazi scholars in Europe were compiling their own modes of studying Torah. The two schools split on many key points.
That's
and that
very
is why
important.
Sephardic...
The two schools split on many key points, the Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews. And so what's happening here, let's go into a little bit more.
And Ashkenazi Jews often follow different customs. So to be Sephardic meant to both be from Sfarad and to follow the specific Sephardic school of religious observance.
That's how we roll, dog.
But the Jews of Sfarad were not allowed to stay in the home where they had lived for centuries. By the late 14th century, Jewish life in Spain had become intolerable. The death blow for Sephardic Jewry came a century later, when King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella decreed that Spain would be a Jew-free zone. Sephardic Jews fanned out across the world, taking their traditions and worldview with them.
So the Sephardic Jews, they start to go all across the world, as he says here, but the majority of them started going into the region of Spain and Lithuania 150 years before the expulsion by Ferdinand and Isabella. And because they have so many cultural differences from the Ashkenazis, when they went into this region, which was mostly dominated by the Ashkenazi Jews, there was a lot of conflict between the Ashkenazi Jews and the Sephardic Jews. So that's something that you got to understand that takes place in Northern Europe, because many of these Jews started going and seeking refuge in Poland, in Lithuania, 150 years before the expulsion by Ferdinand and Isabella. And then the Jews that were able to weather the persecutions that took place during the Black Death, during the bubonic plague, then when Ferdinand and Isabella come along and then they eventually expel the Jews in 1492, many of them have to leave and go to Northern Europe as well and mix in with the Ashkenazi Jews. Very important that you understand that. Here's another clip about the persecutions that took place during the Black Death. I want you to take a listen to this.
For centuries, the Jewish communities of Europe had existed in a precarious balance, often protected by official church doctrine, yet frequently targeted by fervent Christian animosity. The church, in its wisdom, recognized the Jewish roots of Jesus himself, a fact that, on paper at least, afforded some measure of protection. But when the plague descended with its relentless, indiscriminate brutality, reason thought often dissolved into primal fear and desperate superstition. Think of it, nearly half the population gone. Entire villages decimated, families wiped out. The sheer scale of the horror was beyond comprehension for people who understood little, if anything, of germ theory or epidemiology. How else could such a catastrophe be explained but through divine wrath, or worse, through the malevolent hand of a human agent? And so, a monstrous accusation began to whisper, then to shout, across the terrified landscape. The Jews were poisoning the wells. This horrifying notion, this insidious lie, found fertile ground in an age ripe with existing anti-Semitism. Why the Jews? Well, for one, they were often a distinct and sometimes isolated community, preserving their own customs and practices, including dietary laws and often separate water sources within their ghettos.
Not only that, it is part of the Jewish religion going back to ancient times to wash your hands before you eat, to wash before. These are just. They didn't understand any of this stuff. They didn't understand anything. Like, you think about COVID, when COVID happened, and everybody, when they were saying, wash your hands and make sure that you wash your hands before you do anything. That's part of safe practices during a pandemic, and this was part of Jewish customs. So since they were segregated into their own communities, and they had these practices of washing and washing their hands before they eat and their own water supply, then they were not getting sick and dying as rapidly and at the same frequency as the other Catholics around them that didn't have the same practices. So the Catholics and the Christians would look at these Jews and say, look, they're not dying in the same numbers that we're dying. What's going on? They must be poisoning us. This is what was going on, and why the Jews were persecuted in Spain 150 years prior to them being expelled from Spain.
Why the Jews? Well, for one, they were often a distinct and sometimes isolated community, preserving their own customs and practices, including dietary laws and often separate water sources within their ghettos. When the plague seemed to strike their communities with less ferocity in some areas, or simply when desperate minds sought a convenient scapegoat, this difference was twisted into a damning indictment. The logic, if you can call it that, was brutally simple. If they weren't dying as quickly, they must be causing it. And the pressure to confess for those accused was immense. Imagine the terror of being seized, dragged before zealous, fear-crazed mobs, or even civic authorities, and subjected to the persuasion of torture. Confessions, coerced under unimaginable duress, were then paraded as proof, further fanning the flames of paranoia and hatred. It was a vicious, self-perpetuating cycle of fear, accusation, and violence.
All right, so many of these Jews, thousands of them, migrated north into Northern Europe, into Poland. They were invited into Poland and Lithuania to seek refuge there. Again, the Sephardic Jews began to mix with the Ashkenazi Jews. There were some problems in these Jewish communities. And then you have the persecution of the Jews in Poland. I have this clip that explains what took place in Poland. This is before the pogroms in the 19th and 20th century, before the Holocaust. The Holocaust was actually the final straw. But I'm explaining to you what started the Zionist movement when all of this history in Europe is what initiated. Then when you have this history I'm getting ready to show you that happened in Poland prior to the pogroms that took place in Russia, and then the invasion of the Nazis into Poland and the persecution that took place in Poland there where they had come 500, 600 years before to seek refuge. And now the Nazis are coming in and executing the Holocaust on these people. These are all the things that led up to why Herzl and the Zionist says that we got to get out of Europe. We got to have our own Jewish state. And like I've told you, when they started looking at places where they were going to flee to create the Jewish state, they weren't looking at Palestine and the Levant only. They were looking at the Oblast in Russia. They were looking at Argentina. They were looking at Uganda. They were looking at Cyprus. They were looking at all these different places because, quite frankly, Herzl and many of these Zionists in the beginning, they weren't particularly religious at all. They just knew that they needed to get out of Europe because of all this persecution that they had been under for centuries throughout Europe. All right, so take a listen to what happened in Poland. Take a listen.
As early as the 11th century, expulsions from Western Europe led Jews to find a new home in Poland. In 1264, the King of Poland offered his protection to the Jews, and by the 1300s and 1400s, Polish kings actively encouraged Jewish settlement. The Jews became prosperous, trading goods across networks that stretched from Venice to Crimea, and holding leases on a variety of assets. Their religious life flourished too, and by the middle of the millennia, Polish Jewry was experiencing a golden era. But as they rose in prominence, the Jews also faced escalating persecution. In the mid-1300s, Jews were blamed for the Black Plague. In 1399, a rabbi and 13 elders were accused of destroying church property and burned alive at the stake. But these acts paled in comparison to what was ahead when stirrings of rebellion threatened Jewish stability in the region. In 1569, Ukrainian territory fell under Polish rule, much to the dismay of the Cossacks, an adventurous Eastern Orthodox people made up of runaway serfs, bandits, and traders. The Cossacks created self-governing militias and opposed anyone perceived as a threat, including the Polish state. They hoped to one day free Ukraine from Poland's Catholic rule. 26 years later, Bogdan Khmelnytsky, the son of a low-ranking Polish nobleman, was born in central Ukraine. His mother, according to many sources, was of Cossack descent. By 1620, Bogdan had completed his studies at a Catholic college, and while many of his fellow students embraced Catholicism, Bogdan remained true to the Eastern Orthodox Church and his Cossack roots. Shortly after college, Bogdan entered into military service and quickly rose through the ranks of the Cossacks' military. Throughout the 1630s, national religious oppression from the Poles led to a number of small Cossack uprisings. While a free Ukraine was never far from the mind of a Cossack like Bogdan, he was generally not involved. Instead, he spent his time building a family and maintaining his estate. But everything changed in 1646 when a Polish nobleman laid claim to Khmelnytsky's estate. He sent a local official to harass Bogdan, damage his property, and violently beat his son. Bogdan did what he could to fight back, but despite twice pleading his case to the King of Poland, his property was ultimately seized. Fueled by this personal injustice, Khmelnytsky organized disparate bands of Cossacks and peasants into armies. Capitalizing on long-held discontent after years of persecution by the Poles, Khmelnytsky promised to liberate Ukrainians from the Polish oppressors and, because of his celebrated military career, became the rebellion's leader. On January 25, 1648, Bogdan led the Cossack uprising through Ukraine. At the time, some Jews were in charge of large Ukrainian estates, acquired by Polish nobility, and even given the responsibility of collecting taxes. Sadly, the Ukrainian peasants were fervently anti-Semitic and viewed Jews as an active arm of the oppressive Polish system. Rallying his troops, Khmelnytsky declared that Poland had sold the Ukrainians as slaves into the hands of the accursed Jews. One by one, Jewish towns were savagely destroyed. The first large-scale massacre took place in the town of Nemirov. They massacred about 6,000 holy souls in the town, and they drowned several hundreds in the water and with all kinds of severe torments. Another first-hand account relays, some of them had their skins flayed off them and their flesh was flung to the dogs. They ripped up the bellies of pregnant women, took out the unborn child, and flung them in their faces.
All right, so this is what's going on in Ukraine, Russia region, in Poland. This is what's going on 300 years before the pogroms start, which we're going to talk about here in a moment. This fervor, anti-Jewish fervor throughout all of Europe, starting in southern Europe, in Spain, and Italy, and France, and then moving into northern Europe, into the Poland, Lithuanian, Russian, Ukrainian region. So as these, particularly the Sephardic Jews, come into that region of northern Europe, invited there for refuge, hundreds of years later, they're again having to face persecution in northern Europe, starting with these persecutions by the Cossacks and the Ukrainians. But then we're going to move into what happens in the 19th century with the pogroms. But let's listen to just a little bit more of this.
1649, the golden age of Polish Jewry had abruptly come to an end. Bogdan Khmelnytsky's revolution lasted 9 years, and while it liberated Ukraine from Polish conquest, it is estimated that between 1648 and 1653, more than 300 Jewish communities were destroyed. Though there is still debate as to the exact number, at least thousands of Jews were killed, and some sources suggest that the death toll was as high as 100,000.
Thousands of Jews killed, and some estimates 100,000. I mean, this is long before the Holocaust, people. And it's important because everyone says that the Zionist movement, if you don't know, the Zionist movement started long before the Holocaust. But the thing that accelerated the Zionist movement was the Holocaust, because the Holocaust, like, again, was the final straw. This was like, look, this is it. We got to get the hell out of here. I mean, we've been persecuted for centuries in Europe. We got to find a place to go, is why the Zionist movement took off the way that it did in the beginning of, or at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. And the Holocaust was like, that was the final nail in the coffin. We got to go. We got to get the hell out of here. And so this was the persecution that the Jews were under for centuries in Europe, for centuries. And then the pogroms started. We'll read a little bit of this Wikipedia page. A pogrom is a violent riot incited with the aim of massacring or expelling an ethnic or religious group, usually applied to attacks on Jews. The term entered the English language from Russia to describe the late 19th and 20th century attacks on Jews in the Russian Empire, mostly with the Pale of Settlement. Retrospectively, similar attacks against Jews, which occurred other times in places, were renamed pogroms. So this is what the pogroms were. This is what initiated the Zionist movement, and Theodor Herzl and his groups saying that we got to get out of here. We got to get out of Austria. We got to get out of Germany. We got to get out of Ukraine. We got to get out of Poland, even, because you don't know, first place that the Nazis invade is Poland, where many of these Jews had come centuries before to seek refuge. This is a clip about the pogroms. I want you to take a listen.
Alexander III, who assumed the throne in 1881, blamed his father's assassination on the Jews. This was, unsurprisingly, a complete fabrication. Nevertheless, the accusation led to waves of pogroms. Though pogroms started as early as 1821 in Odessa, Ukraine, these violent attacks didn't become widespread until Alexander III. This wave kicked off the beginning of the end for the Pale communities. Jews were once again made to be the scapegoat of the nation's problems. New laws reinstated restrictions where Jews could live and own land outside shtetls. Arrests, beatings, and deportations became daily occurrences, not just for the lower classes, but also for the middle class and in the Jewish intelligentsia. The first Russian Revolution of the early 20th century failed to overthrow the Tsar, and this final period of the Tsarist system was particularly disastrous for the Jews. They were terrorized by as many as 284 pogroms, many of which were not only supported by, but often organized by the government. The violence resulted in over 50,000 Jews being murdered in the 4 years between 1903 and 1907.
50,000 Jews slaughtered in 4 years during these pogroms.
By the government. The violence resulted in over 50,000 Jews being murdered in the 4 years between 1903 and 1907. Most Jews realized that the end had come for Jewish life in Russia, and many who could moved. Around 2.5 million Jews emigrated from Russia between 1881 and 1914 to places like the United States, Western Europe, and what was known as the region of Palestine, the land of Israel. For many, it was to escape the pogroms. For others, it was a move towards a world of new opportunities and ideas away from the shtetl. The Pale of Settlement was officially abolished in 1917, and any remnant was destroyed in the Holocaust. Though the destiny of the Russian shtetl proved to be a tragic one, Jewish life inside was often rich and happy despite crushing obstacles. Innovations resulted in an enriched educational system for Judaism, personal growth, and revolutions in Torah study. Many of these changes have become essential aspects of how Judaism is lived today.
All right, so that gives you a little bit of insight of, it doesn't go into detail about what the pogroms were, but they were very violent uprisings against the Jews, the same things that had taken place in Southern Europe, in Spain, in Portugal, during the time of the bubonic plague and the Black Death, and then as they moved to Northern Europe, into Poland, Lithuania, Austria, Germany, and Russia, they were persecuted more. And this is what gave rise to the Zionist movement. Many, like the video that we just watched, many Jews had already started migrating back to the Levant. This is before the nation of Israel was officially a nation, before the Holocaust. Quite frankly, if you know the story of the transfer agreement and the agreement that Hitler and the Nazis made with Jews in Germany prior to even the Holocaust happening and the invasion of Poland, Hitler made a agreement with wealthy Jews in Germany who were able to migrate to Palestine before the Jewish state and transfer their wealth at a small fee to the Nazis. He allowed them to do that. But these Jews had already started thinking about where they were going to go, how they were going to set up a Jewish state. And this is what initiated the Zionist movement. Not going to get back into the Babylonian captivity today because I don't have very much time and it doesn't make sense to get back into it today. But I'll pick back up with the Babylonian captivity in the next podcast. I just wanted to give an overview of the persecution of the Jews worldwide that happened for millennia. I mean, going back to the first of the persecutions, which was the Assyrian captivity, the Babylonian captivity, the the Greek persecution, the Roman persecution. For millennia, the Jews have been persecuted. So I want you to understand that, why they are a little bit sensitive to what's going on today, and what they're calling the rise of anti-Semitism. This is centuries of persecution. Some of them, some of the persecution that the Jews have suffered, you can say that it's because of their behavior and things that they've done. But some of it, like what happened in Spain during the bubonic plague, I mean, they weren't doing anything but living their lives, and they were blamed for this pandemic that they had nothing to do with. So many of the persecutions that happened against the Jews were just because people were jealous of their success and their community. So I just wanted you to understand that, and why there is so much sensitivity around what is being called the rise of anti-Semitism today. This is a long history, a long, brutal history, and it is prophesied. What's happening to the Jews outside of the homeland that God set up for them is prophesied, that they're never meant to live outside of the state, the territory that is currently Israel now, that God gave them. But they had to abide by God's covenant. And when they started worshiping other gods and participating in paganism and idol worship and all this stuff that drove them, that said, the Bible says that God drove them and scattered them out of that region, and that they would be persecuted. So the Bible says that I'm going to scatter this. We've read this in Deuteronomy 4. You can go and read it, that God is going to scatter you to all of these regions, and you're going to be persecuted in all those regions. And then when you're persecuted in all those regions, you're going to repent. You're going to look to the God of your forefathers, and you're going to say, what have we done? You're going to repent, and he's going to bring you back into the land. And, this is a very long and brutal history that the Jewish people have suffered for, again, millennia, not centuries, not decades, millennia. So we'll pick up back with the Babylonian captivity in the next podcast, and hopefully get through that so we can get into the building of the second temple, what happens during the Maccabean revolts, what initiated the Maccabean revolt. We talked a little bit about that in the last podcast, and we'll get back into this in the next podcast. So hope you guys have a great week, and then I'll see you on Friday.